In this video, we're going to create the attack system for the Moss Giant. In order to get started, we first want to be able to attack the Moss Giant. If we select our skeleton enemy, you'll notice here that he has a Box Collider 2D on him, and it's set to trigger. That's what's allowing our player to actually slash through him to detect him. So we need to do the exact same thing for our Moss Giant. If we select our Moss Giant enemy, the parent, let's add a Box Collider 2D. And we can go ahead and shape this using the Edit Collider tool to our Moss Giant. Just drag it down. And once you're happy with that, you can go ahead and stop editing the collider. And you want to make sure that is trigger set to true. That's going to allow us to pass through the object as well as detect the collisions on it. Once you've done that, save your scene. The next thing we want to do is open up our Moss Giant script, and we want to implement our iDamageable interface. So here we have Moss Giant enemy, and it implements iDamageable. So we previously did this, but if yours is missing it, go ahead and add your public int health property, followed by your damage code. And inside here, let's go ahead and just add a debug.log. We'll say Moss Giant, and then we'll say damage function was called, so we know. Save this. We should now be able to run up to the Moss Giant with our player, swing our sword, and detect it. Let's run Unity and test that out. Alright, and there you go. We have a log down here in the bottom left that says Moss Giant damage. So now our Moss Giant is able to take damage. We now need to just control the logic for it to stop moving, face us, attack us, and then as well as do its hit animation for when it takes damage. Very similar to everything we did with our skeleton. So let's stop playing, and let's open up our skeleton script as well as our Moss Giant. So here we have our skeleton, here's our Moss Giant, and essentially they have the exact same controls right now. So inside the movement, they're calling the base movement function. So for this guy's already doing it, but we may want to add certain things. Like for instance, for the skeleton, we've added based on the direction that it's moving, and if it's in combat, this is what's actually controlling the logic to face the player. We may merge this into the enemy class, but what's important right now is to just get the functionality working for the Moss Giant. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this exact information here, and we'll apply it to our Moss Giant. And once we get it all working, we can then take a look and say, hey, this is identical to the skeleton, and we'll then merge it into the enemy. So to get started here, what we can do is we can copy exactly all of this. This is for facing left and right while it's in combat. So leave it there, just copy it, go into your Moss Giant, and we need to include that method. So we need to say public override void movement. So above our damage method, we'll come here and we'll say public override void movement. It's already going to call the base movement function. And then here we're adding the ability for it to face the player when it's in combat. If we save this and run it, we want to make sure we're doing iteration testing here, especially when you're copying and pasting from script to script. Now that we've added the ability to face the player, we just want to make sure that this code isn't going to break. As of right now, it can't become, there's no bool for it to be in combat. We haven't created that part for it yet because we haven't damaged it. However, we just want to make sure that functionality is exactly as it is and nothing is broken. And that was the case. Let's reopen up our script and let's do our damage section. So inside the damage function for the skeleton, we print out a message that says damage, we subtract their health, we say anim.setTrigger hit, and then is hit equals true, and then anim.setBool in combat is true. Now before we can do any of this, we need to include the anim.setTrigger hit. So let's look at our skeleton animator real quick. If we select our skeleton, go to the sprite, and double click the sprite controller, it will bring up the animator view. On this, we have an any state that transitions to hit, and it's based on a trigger of hit, and then afterwards, it just instantly goes back to idle. So we now need to create the hit animation for our sprite. So here is our Moss Giant. Let's select the sprite. We need to create a new animation for it called hit. So select your mouse giant hit underneath your sprite's characters, and we need to slice this up. This is going to be a 512, so change pixels per unit to 512. Open up your sprite editor, hit apply. Within here, and you want to make sure that you change your sprite mode to multiple if it's on single. Now we can slice by grid size and make it 512 by 512. Hit slice, and we have individual squares. Select apply. Once it's grayed out, you can X out of this. And we'll create a new animation. So with the sprite of the moss giant selected, we're going to create a new animation by going to the animation on the left here, idle, create new clip, and we'll call this hit. From there, we'll go to sprites, characters, moss giant, animations, and save it here. Once we've done that, we can then grab our sprites and grab each frame 0 through 15 by holding down shift and drag it over. Once we've done that, we can then sample it, and we'll go ahead and make this about 15 frames per second. And there we have a nice hit. Okay, so we have our animation set up. We can now hop over to the controller of the moss giant by going to the animator view. And from here, we can then say we have this hit animation and we want to create an any state transition. So right click any state, make a transition to hit. And when do we do that? We do that when we trigger the hit. So we're going to create a new parameter called trigger, and it's going to be hit. From there, with the any state selected, we're going to say any state triggers hit. And for transition duration, we want it to be 0. We don't want to fade from whatever it's coming from. And then once it's finished its hit animation, we're just going to say exit time, go to idle, and set the fixed duration to 0 as well. From there, we can save our scene. Let's select our moss giant enemy and then go to the sprite, make sure everything looks okay. Save our scene, and we can now copy over the code from the damage function into our moss giant. So open up Visual Studios, and we can go ahead and we can take this entire damage function. Let's copy that and bring it into moss giant. And we can update the log to include moss giant. So moss giant damage. All right, so we're going to call that log. We're going to remove 1 health from our moss giant. We are going to grab the anim.setTrigger hit, is hit equals true. And then here, anim.setBool in combat. Now this is hit equals true comes from the parent class of our enemy, is hit, which is a bool here. And then based on that logic, it tells it, hey, stop moving right here. Okay, so let's take a look, make sure we have everything set up. One thing I want to make sure that we have here is that the health system is in place properly. I believe in our skeleton, inside the init method, we're assigning the health to our base health. Because you'll see here that in the inspector for the moss giant, we gave it a health in the inspector, and we're using that property. We want that property to take the value of whatever we assign it in the inspector. So for our moss giant, let's say it takes 5 hits to actually kill it. Let's open up our script here, go into the moss giant, and after we initialize, we're going to say health equals base.health. That's going to grab the inspector value for the moss giant. Once we've done that, we also want to make sure that we have our destroy property here with our damage. So if the health is less than 1, it will destroy. So essentially here, I should be able to now attack our moss giant 5 times, and then it will destroy. Let's run the game, test it out. So here we go. And there you go. You can see our hit animation is working. So I hit. Now it goes back into idle, and then it continues walking, which is great. And you'll see here that he's not able to attack us just yet, and we'll fix that in just a moment. But we want to make sure that I can actually kill him by attacking him 5 times. And there you go. So he is now dead. Now we need to look at making him attack us back. So here, if we're in idle and we transition to attack when in combat is true. So when does in combat become true? In combat becomes true when it gets damaged. And we say anim.setBool in combat is true. So it should have been in combat. And then here, just looking at the skeleton here, in combat, and it is hit is set to true. And if we check the enemy, let's just look at the logic here. So we do our movement. And it looks like we only do movement if we're not in idle and we're not in combat. And then here we do our movement. This is flipping us our sprite in the direction we're moving. This is saying once you get to the end, play your idle. If is hit is false, then we move. Otherwise we stay still because we're in combat. And then here we check distance. Let's see, if distance is greater than 2 and setBool in combat is false. Okay, so let's check and see what our distance is. Because anim.setBool in combat, we might be more, it might think that we're more than 2. So let's go ahead and run this and test that out. We might need to log out the distance between us and the moss giant. Because you'll see here that it goes from, although it does know it's in combat. So in combat is set to true, but it's going to its walk animation. And that's because we actually need to include that. So here, when should it go to walk? I bet you if we check the skeleton, we probably have different parameters for that. So on the skeleton sprite, we go to walk when in combat is false. And that's what we're missing. And then when idle, and then we go back to idle based on the condition of the idle trigger. So let's include that. So we need to copy this over. So we will open up our moss giant sprite. When do we go from idle to walk? When in combat is false. And then when do we go from walk to idle? When we trigger idle. So you can just keep it like that. Let's save this. Let's hop back into Unity and test it out. So here we are. I attack. It takes a hit. It's going to do an idle, and then it's going to attack me. It's going to go idle, attack. And we can now fight it. All right, and there we go. So we successfully created our attack system for the moss giant, and it took 12 minutes to do that versus an hour to set up our skeleton. Now that we have it working, in the next video, we're going to look at merging the functionality for the moss giant and skeleton into our enemy class. I'll see you guys in the next video.